Riyadh, the center of the Al Saud dynasty. The founder of this newly unified country, King Abdulaziz, permission to search for oil in his kingdom. The concession to search, negotiated by Sheikh Abdallah al-Suleiman, the king's finance minister, granted exclusive rights to prospect for oil in the entire eastern region of Saudi Arabia. At a small compound on the seacoast at Jubail, headquarters of the American company, Saudi guides and interpreters prepare for one of journeys and the awesome task of mapping and exploring an area twice the size of Texas. The giant quest was by a small group of geologists. The first to survey the terrain for the slightest sign of what might lie beneath, Bert Miller, and his partner in the center, Krug Henry. Years of observation, years of conflicting doubts and convictions, all meticulously recorded.
With the recent bombings, U.S. airstrikes inside Iraq on Shia proxy forces, I figured I'd do a video explaining how the United States and the Gulf, their long-standing relationship, which goes back 70 years now, explaining the general relationship and how it relates to what we see today when it comes to American geopolitics. And one must start at the very beginning. And so in 1941, a U.S. oil company by the name of Standard Oil, which is now called Aramco, became the first U.S. oil company to find oil in the country itself. Oil reserves, which were prosperous, plenty of economic prosperity, of substantial political leverage to a country that was basically formed with the original intent to become a monarchy. It is the only country in the world that is a functioning monarchy today. The country of Saudi Arabia was once known as the Emirate of Diriyah, which was under the control of the Umayyads and later the Ottoman Empire, which Great Britain became a true major influence in destroying the Ottomans and allowing the founder Abdulaziz al Saud bin Saud to become the primary founder of Saudi Arabia by capturing major cities such as Najd and Hejaz. And so Saudi Arabia became a whole country, which is based on two principles. One, its foundational theology, headed by a nomad of sorts, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who in his own version of this school of thought, which is called Wahhabi Islam or Salafi Islam, in which he would want to see a return of all Muslims return back to the age of the caravan, or the first two generations of the Prophet Muhammad. And that includes a disallowance of praying at the tomb of Muhammad, foreigners to come into the country, and to disallow New Age traditions he thought were offensive, along with the military stratagem of the Emirate of Diriyah. And together with Abdulaziz al Saud and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, together they would create the country on those two principles itself. with the United States now becoming the true power behind the country, as well as Great Britain. This is the coalition forces of the West. Saudi Arabia all of a sudden becomes a nobody in the terms of the political spectrum, now becomes a force in the country. However, looks can be very deceiving. Over time, the United States started regulating the oil market. And because of this, Saudi Arabia slowly started becoming a country which modernized the Arab world. And because of this, throughout the 1950s and 60s, madrasas started popping up throughout the Arabian Peninsula, throughout Southeast Asia, and slowly transforming most of these socialist Arab states into becoming countries that would have a booming Islamic theology that was basically non-existent during the early 19th and 20th century, when pan-Arab nationalism was at the forefront, headed by former Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Countries such as Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, Libya, even Iraq at one point, Jordan, a lot of these countries enjoyed a secular ideology, socialism, a standard way of living, almost similar to what we see here in the West. There were no full niqabs or hijabs. There wasn't a Sharia law governing these countries. Many of these countries were headed by certain authoritarian figures, such as Nasser, Assad himself in Syria, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. And so slowly we started witnessing these Arab nations throughout the 30s and 40s trying to distance themselves away from Western influence. What they wanted to do was become just as a economic formidable region as, say, the United States or Europa, for example, headed by Great Britain, Germany, France. But Great Britain saw a threat to this, and they decided to reiterate the problems of pan-Arab nationalism. And in 1952, the Britain Foreign Office created a paper called The Problems of Nationalism, which was a construct of how to slowly eliminate the problems afforded by the socialist Arab nations, which were a threat to regulating the oil market and becoming a true power in the region itself. And so they started slowly using the intelligence services, such as the United States Central Intelligence Agency in the latter half of the 1950s and 60s, and the British MI6. And what they did was cause civil unrest in many of these countries, which saw a lot of civil uprisings against these authoritarian figures, presidents of these countries. In 1953, we saw Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh being deposed. Even though he was democratically elected by the people, he was deposed and he had to flee the country. In return, Egypt was led by Reza Pahlavi, called the Shah of Iran, for over 25 years. He led the country with his own Western-backed authoritarian style, ruled with an iron fist. And we saw a lot of uprisings later, the bread riots that came, civil unrest because he was such a total despot, a true totalitarian, authoritarian leader, harsh against the public sector, harsh against the poor and the religious, which caused a an obvious backlash. And of course, in 1979, he was uprooted, forcibly deposed by the Iranian Revolution, by Ali Khomeini himself, Imam Khomeini himself, which saw the U.S. Embassy being raided. And I'll get to that a little bit later in the discussion today. And so, with a lot of these countries now becoming truly in trouble from within, internal turmoil, basically from the foreign and domestic intelligence services of the United States and Great Britain to uproot Arab nationalism. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, through many of their own crown princes and leaders, especially from the religious sector, started pouring millions of dollars into the United States and thus creating one of the largest well-funded lobbies inside the United States, much larger than Israel, but not as politically stout. One thing the Saudi lobby has over the Israeli lobby is money, billions of dollars. I'm talking about throughout the decades, the 40s, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. We're talking about 50, 60 years. Long-standing, billions of dollars going all the way back to Eisenhower, to the present moment. Most of this funding comes from these large Islamic charities, the World Islamic Union being one, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the largest Islamic organization outside the United States, formidably in Egypt, where it started under Hassan al-Banna, made popular through Sayyid Qutb. Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. Muslim Brotherhood has a wide influence, but they also go through many reforms. I know a lot of people like to think of this, especially United States, Israel, and the coalition, big surprise there, designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, even though that they did have troubles from within during the 60s and 70s. This group went through a ton of reformations itself. However, they have dirty hands in the past, but they're not the primary problem. The primary problem is going to come from Saudi Arabia's own brand of theology, Wahhabi Islam, which has had a great head start since the formation of Saudi Arabia, and since, of course, with the United States' influence in the country itself, because of Saudi Arabia being an important military position for the United States, because it's right in the middle of many countries in which the United States would like to destabilize in the future throughout their own geopolitical structure, which I'll get to later with the neoconservative influence of the 1980s and 90s. Saudi Arabia being between in the Gulf of Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, the Sudan, Ethiopia. It is an important it's an important military stratagem. And so not only is Saudi Arabia such an influence with the United States in regards to the oil market and regulating the oil market, it's also an important military stratagem, so that we can base our Air Force, the Army, in stations all around the region. Slowly, this would precipitate. It doesn't happen overnight, so you won't notice the differences and also what's taking place. But through our indifference, through their abhorrent human rights violations that were happening in the decades preceding our initial relationship, including weekly beheadings at Riyadh Square, the flogging of women, the moral religious police that they used to have for decades the subjugation of the Shiites that were living there south of the country, north of the country. And so we have a lot of human rights violations totally being ignored by the United States because the prosperous relationship supersedes human rights. We don't care about human rights. And so in the 1980s, we see an uprise in religious fundamentalism. And so for the past 30 years, the millions, the hundreds of millions of dollars into these madrasas all throughout the Middle East and Southeast Asia, in countries like Indonesia, which has the largest Muslim population in the world, the Philippines, Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, even the United States, Canada, start seeing madrasas popping up, Islamic charities popping up, becoming much more influential. And then 1979, we see three important events happen in this year. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Saudi Karbala takeover by al-Qaddafi, and the Iranian Revolution. The religious uprising against the old norms, pan-Arab nationalism, secular structures that didn't work, that failed to uproot the Israeli problem, which started at the Six-Day War, which was a moral defeat for Muslims globally, which had the backing of the United States and the coalition partners as well. And so we saw the slow transformation of Western hegemony in the region slowly start to take a backwards turn because of the continued Western imperialism, which is one-sided, completely in favor of two countries, and that is Saudi Arabia and Israel. But we'll concentrate on Saudi Arabia and how it affects hegemony in the region. And throughout the 1980s, we started witnessing a rise of Islamic fundamentalism. Why? Because after the defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan, the United States, who were financially backing the Mujahideen, and not just them, but Saudi donors to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars, using the Pakistan ISI as the conduit, not NGOs or foreign agencies. A lot of these Afghan warlords like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Jalaluddin Haqqani, the more fanatical Afghans. And then you had the Arabs, foreign Arabs from all over the world who entered Afghanistan. Now, after the war, they either went back or they had to go to other countries to precipitate the jihad that we helped ferment in the country itself. And one of those people that initialized this ideology of defensive jihad was Abdullah Azzam.
في جريمة أصبح عيبا نستحي منه. حمل السلاح أصبحت وحشية وهمجية. نعم، هم الغربيون والأمريكان كرجل يلبس ثوبا أبيض ويذبح شاة، فإذا انتفضت رجلها وهي تلفظ أنفاسها ونزلت نقطة على ثوبه الأبيض فإن هذه الشاة ليست مؤدبة ولا مهذبة. نحن كذلك يريدون أن يذبحونا، بد أن تنتهك أعراضنا ونحن نبتسم في وجوه الذين ينتهكون أعراضنا. يجب أن تسلب أموالنا ونحن منحنين إليهم. يسير يسير. يجب أن تؤخذ مقدساتنا، فإذا حملنا رصاصة فنحن إرهابيون. إن كان الإرهاب هكذا فنحن إرهابي.
Abdullah Azzam himself was born in Palestine, Jenin, uprooted. His family was uprooted out of his home by the Israeli IDF through the Intifada. And so he became a teacher in Egypt, Syria, and then he went to Saudi Arabia, and that's when he was introduced to the Wahhabi Islam. And he took a great interest into Wahhabi Islam and took those principles with him to Afghanistan. And through the influence of Wahhabi Islam, he introduced defensive jihad. And this spread like wildfire. And so as the Afghans were getting slaughtered in the battlefield, most of the replacements coming in were the Arabs, even though the Arabs had a very minimal effect in the war. Some say between 5 to 10% of the actual fighters in Afghanistan were Arabs. And there was only one Arab military base, which was called the Al-Masada. Now, I did a video on the Al-Masada. I would advise you to go watch that video and understand the nature of how Al-Qaeda became an organization. It was through this Al-Masada camp. Most of the camps in Afghanistan were Afghan-based. Afghans saw Arabs as a nuisance. They weren't very good fighters. The one good thing about the Arabs was their willingness to die for the cause, martyrdom, which was not supported by most of the moderate Afghans. Most of these people were nationalists, fighting against the communist regime influenced by the Soviet Union. And so Saudi Arabia started funneling millions of dollars. Most of these Mujahideen factions brought that money back to these respective organizations. And so soon, the advent of most of these radical fundamentalist groups really started becoming a thorough force. The Egyptian Islamic Jihad, headed by Muhammad al-Faraj and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Gamma Islamiyah, headed by Omar Abdel Rahman. Then you have Boko Haram in East Africa. The Jaish Muhammad in Pakistan. And later on, the Islamic State, which was the Tal al-Jihad, headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, which later became the Islamic State of Iraq, which then becomes the Islamic State and the Levant, under Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula, Al-Qaeda in the Sudan. Al-Qaeda became a large international organization while it was being headed by Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden being, of course, the money manager himself, which is the reason why Al-Qaeda became such a large organization. A lot of these Salafist groups, under the theology of Wahhabi Islam, were backed by Saudi Arabia. Another great example would be the attacks of September 11th, 2001. It is for the public record that today we have financial transactions made by former U.S-Saudi ambassador Bandar bin Sultan from his wife Haifa bin Faisal. Her bank account from Riggs Bank went to a wife of a woman named Mawida Dawijak, who is the wife of Osama Basnan. Who's Osama Basnan? Osama Basnan was a Saudi GID contact living in San Diego who knew Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf Hazmi. That money went to those two people through a period of 14, 16 months. Incremental financial transactions, $4,000, $5,000 every 2 to 3 week period. Later on, the purpose of this financing was explained by Osama Basnan and his wife, saying they were for daily routines. One was for a hairdressing business or whatnot. So they gave these ridiculous answers to the FBI. But that's not all of it. So here we have Bandar bin Sultan, who's a close friend to the bin Laden family, who owns the largest construction magnate in the Gulf, the Saudi bin Laden group, and who, according to Bandar bin Sultan, he knew bin Laden very little and thought to him as a very simple man, a quiet man, in which he was. But something tells me that he isn't telling you the whole truth. And to this day, the United States continues their cover-up of Saudi finance and complicity with certain 9/11 hijackers. Now, I'm not talking about the Hamburg cell, which was headed by Mohammed Atta Marwan al-Shehi. They also were getting financial transactions coming from Western Union by Mustafa al-Hassawi, who's currently locked up at Guantanamo Bay. Where was he getting that money from? Saudi donors. This was reiterated in the Congressional Joint House inquiry into the September 11th attacks in through their infamous 28 pages, which is redacted from public view. It's still redacted today. But why? Are we still showing deference to a country that has massive human rights violations, that has a direct connection to the 9/11 attacks through financial transactions that went to certain Al-Qaeda contacts who later become 9/11 hijackers? And in the days preceding the attacks, the bin Ladens and members of the Saudi royal family were personally flown out of the country. This came from high up, according to National Security Council advisor, head of the counterterrorism unit, Richard Clark, who had a list of over 60 names of people who were allowed to fly out of the country. We should have subpoenaed these people and asked them to put themselves on the public record at least, but we didn't do that. Now, we also have Saudi contacts in Los Angeles who gave material and financial aid to Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. Now, I named Osama Basnan and his wife Mawida Dawijak, but there was also Fahad al-Thumeri and Omar al-Bayoumi. In fact, the two hijackers, the first two that entered the United States on January 15th of 2000, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, who stood at an undisclosed location for 2 weeks, later met in this nondescript restaurant, met a guy named Omar al-Bayoumi, and according to him, Omar al-Bayoumi gave or helped give al-Mihdhar and al-Hazmi lodging for 2 months, rent-free, he paid, He helped get them their driver's licenses, and he allowed them to use his cell phone. The reason Omar al-Bayoumi gave to the 9/11 Commission was that he likes helping Arabs coming into the United States. Fahad al-Thameri, who headed the Los Angeles imam, he was the imam of the Los Angeles Mosque, who asked a Tunisian cab driver, Kwali Benamarine, to pick up al-Midar and al-Hazmi and drive them to the mosque so he could meet them. And he gave them lodging in a hotel that he had owned multiple rooms in. Fahad al-Thameri was also interviewed by the 9/11 Commission, and they found him to be quite deceptive. In fact, one of the questions they asked him was, do you know who Khalid al-Midar and Nawaf al-Hazmi is? And he said, no, he did not. But because the Saudi General Intelligence Directive officials were standing behind him, and they weren't invited to the interview, but they made sure to monitor the interview, whispered in his ear, Fahad al-Thameri then said, oh, yes, I saw them on TV. So he basically lied to these people. From there, Saudi Arabia now is considered a major power player in the Gulf. They're also a terrible influence in the region for hegemony in the region, true Islamic hegemony. They consider their arch rival Iran and the Shiite population, Iran having the largest Shia population on earth. And so, for decades, the United States has been a primary antagonist toward Iran, with help from Israel and the Gulf. That's Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. And so their continued conflict with Iran itself is even seen to this day, especially in Syria, Iraq, and in Yemen. Right now, as we speak, we have Shia and Iranian proxy forces trying to fight against Wahhabi, Saudi-backed Islamic militants like Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, Al-Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra. These are the real terrorist groups, the ones that slaughter all Muslims, which would make them un-Islamic in the ironic twist. And so we, the United States, then go and covertly support these Saudi-backed groups, these terrorists. In one such operation, which was constructed by former General David Petraeus under the Obama administration in 2011, this was a covert operation called Timber Sycamore, in which was supported by King Abdullah of Jordan and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, in which it would be Saudi financially backed to support and train these Wahhabi Salafi groups to try and overthrow democratically elected President Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The primary agency in training and arming these groups was the Central Intelligence Agency. At first, Obama balked at the operation, but then was influenced, basically from King Abdullah and Netanyahu. It was ended in 2017 by then U.S. President Donald Trump. That program ended. But you can see why we have so many foreign Arabs in Syria fighting against the Assad government, the Kurds, which is a paramilitary force from Turkey fighting against Erdogan, and of course the Shia proxy forces like Hezbollah, Iranian Revolutionary Guard, who are trying to fight off this, these Salafi terrorist groups. Meanwhile, the United States, who on the face of everything is trying to show that, yes, we're fighting the war on terror. And yes, that's why we're in Syria and Iraq in the first place, and in Afghanistan. But meanwhile, using covert means to support the Salafi groups that are being funded by Saudi Arabia. The ideology, the primary ideology of these groups, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Wahhabi Islam, Saudi Arabia, creating groups like the Islamic State, which are compromised of foreign Arabs.
سير وشمر الساعد عسى أن تكون لبنة صالحة فيه وهنيئا لمن أوفى بما عاهد الله عليه.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. الحمد لله الذي رزقنا أن نهاجر في سبيل الله وننضم في هذه الدولة الإسلامية في العراق والشام، ونحمد الله الذي رزقنا وجمعنا مع هؤلاء الأسود دولة الإسلام في كل مكان. والحمد لله الذي رزقنا أن نبايع أمير المؤمنين أبي بكر القريشي البغدادي حفظه الله. يا أميرنا، لقد بيعنا على السمع والطاعة وبيعنا على الموت، فامضي بنا حيثما أمرك الله. ونقول للطواغيت والكفار في كل مكان، نحن نقول لكم كما قال إبراهيم عليه الصلاة والسلام لأبيه: إنا براء منكم ومما تعبدون من دون الله كفرنا بكم وبدا بيننا وبينكم العداوة والبغضاء أبدا حتى تؤمنوا بالله وحده. ونقول لكم كما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم: إنما جئناكم بذبح فأبشروا يا أيها الكفار. والله العظيم لنطهر الجزيرة منكم يا أيها الأنجاس، ونفتح البيت المقدس منكم يا أيها اليهود، ونفتح روما نحن كالبني إسحاق، لنفتح روما والأندلس بإذن الله تعالى. هذه جوازاتكم يا أيها الطواغيت في كل عالم. والله نحن مسلمين، نحن مسلمين، نحن مسلمين.
من وريد القلب تروي عندما كل الهضاب نخطر الله وجوها لم تزل مثل السحاب. من وريد القلب تروي.
A destabilized Islamic dominated fracturing of the country itself. Libya itself is just a sectarian mess. Syria is basically hanging on by a thread. Most of the country is decimated by the aerial bombardments of the United States, their coalition partners, the jihadist groups running around. Iraq went through 2 civil wars. Same thing for Afghanistan. After the Soviets left, they went through 2 bloody civil wars themselves with the Taliban, which was Pakistani funded. And Saudi Arabia, which is one of the primary countries behind us all, which was the initial antagonist for all of this. But all of this is ignored by the general public. You won't hear this in the media. You won't hear this even with the more liberal policies of the United States. I'm not talking about the Democratic Party either. There's nothing progressive about the Democrats. Biden is much more far to the right than, say, Donald Trump when it comes to geopolitics, especially for the Middle East. For those out there, progressives who are saying that we're saved because the Biden administration has finally deposed the disastrous Trump administration. One thing I could say for Trump was at least he wasn't an establishment man. That's why he fired so many of his cabinet hires, like a John Bolton, who, when we hired John Bolton, everybody feared Iran would be next. No, Trump is such a narcissist that he hated being told what to do. That's not the case with Biden or Harris. Just take a look at their National Security Council. Take a look at their cabinet. All former employees, associates of the intelligence apparatuses, like the NSA, the CIA, the Pentagon, corporate magnates, most of these people. Major influences for what we're about to see in the region under the Biden administration. Remember what he said, nothing will fundamentally change. He's right in regards to this. And so, why is Saudi Arabia considered such a staunch ally of the United States? Twofold. One, they're important for our military to strategically place military bases all throughout the United States, as you can see here, as well as being the primary source for oil revenue. We continue to regulate the oil market in the region. There are billions of dollars at stake, not just from oil reserves, but also from private military contractors like Raytheon, LG3 Technologies, Boeing, and why the continued war on terrorism is a farce, because we precipitate terrorism through our drone strikes on hapless civilians, especially in Shia-dominated regions, decimating countries, as I just explained to you before, creating more terrorists as we eliminate terrorists, so the repetition continues. The war on terrorism, much like the war on drugs, is a complete failure because we are allied with actual terrorists. Saudi Arabia is a terrorist supporting country, no matter how many times the New York Times will tell you that they're going through internal reform. Internal reform would be the total absolution of Wahhabi Islam itself. But that would be a pipe dream, because we would have to eliminate the primary forces behind that. But we can't, because that is where most of the primary influences of most of these Salafi organizations come from. And the problem isn't just over there. It's in the country itself. Some of these local madrasas, or most of them anyway, are in poverty-stricken areas, especially abroad. And that's how they continue to spread this ghastly school of thought, which is not Islamic by any means, going by the tenets of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Quthaymeen, Muhammad Hassan, Ibn Baz, who was once the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia. Outdated ideologies located in the Hadiths, the private memoirs of the Prophet Muhammad, attributed to him. But these are self-appointed books. These are not the words of Prophet Muhammad. And so, with the direct contradiction that lies within this theology, Wahhabi Islam, to the nation of Islam, it is no wonder that the United States continues their support of a country that has a long-standing history of human rights abuses, continued abuses in Yemen, which is the largest human rights violations in the world happening right now, and throughout the decades. And of course, the terrorist attacks on the United States in 1993, in 2000 on the USS Cole, and on September 11, 2001. So the question remains, why do we, as an alleged civilized first world nation, support a nation that harbors, protects, and adheres to terrorist principles?